Hello, friends. I have a really good episode for you this week. Two awesome listener questions. The first one is from somebody who has a friend with OCD, and they are asking how they can actually help them instead of facilitating the OCD and actually making it worse in the long run. The second question is from somebody who has gone through a bunch of life changes, including moving in with their longtime partner, and they're finding that they're getting very, very, very specific about their routines to the point that they're a bit obsessive and it's causing problems in their life. So two slightly different questions, but very awesome stuff. So listen in and enjoy. This is the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Robert Duff. I'm a clinical psychologist and a self-help author from Southern California. My goal is to make mental health content for real people, just like you. And in this show, I answer your questions or dive deep into topics related to life, psychology, mental health, relationships, and more. Please be aware that sometimes I use some spicy language, and I also don't shy away from sensitive topics, but I will try to give you a content warning whenever it's relevant. So if all this sounds good to you, let's get started. All right. Hello, friends of all varieties. This is episode 392. Thank you very, very much for joining me today. Before I get into the show, I wanted to point out something really cool, which is this week marks 20 years since my wife and I started dating, which is bonkers. So I started dating her when I was 15 years old. And yeah, I knew ever since then that, we were going to be together, and it's been a pretty, well, I wouldn't say a straight line. We've had a lot of interesting, not even ups and downs, but lefts and rights and all arounds. And, we have a unique relationship, but it's great. And, it's a dating anniversary, but 20 years. Fucking crazy. Anyway, I just wanted to shout that out. My wife doesn't listen to the show really ever, so she probably won't hear this. But if she does, hi. I love you. And we get to go out tonight and, get a nice dinner. Our friend is going to watch our kids for a little bit, and I'm excited for it. But yeah, that's really all I want to say in terms of preamble to the show. Got a couple really good questions, and let's just dive into the first one. The first question reads, "Hi, Duff. I really like your show. You cover so many important topics, and I've learned a lot listening. I have a close friend who has harm OCD, and I don't know how to help. She's in therapy, and we've learned that my help in the past, double checking things for her, like I'll check that the stove is really off, or reassuring her that no one has been or was hurt, like, no, I didn't see anyone in distress in the lake, is actually counterproductive and potentially hindering her progress. What should I do when her OCD is triggered? I want to help, but anything that would make her feel better in the moment is actually worse in the long run, right? How do I support her properly? The anxiety can be very intense, and I want to help." So thank you for the question. Thank you for the praise for the show, and thank you for being a good friend. I appreciate you, and I think this is a really good question, and I can probably help out a bit here with a few ideas for the situation. First thing that we need to do is define some terms and do some education here, because that's really what this is all going to be rooted in. Most people have heard of OCD before, but for anybody who doesn't know, that stands for obsessive compulsive disorder. It's a mental health disorder, and it involves, there are various forms of it, but typically what it involves is obsessions and or compulsions, obviously, obsessive compulsive disorder. And what that means is compulsions. These are basically what you tend to see in movies, in media depictions of OCD. This is where somebody has repetitive or ritualistic behaviors that get in the way of their life. In the question here, there was a really good example of double checking things like the stove being turned off. A lot of times compulsions, they have this element of kind of feel to them, like there's a sense of just right or good enough. And what that means is even if the behavior happens repetitively, if it doesn't feel right to the person with OCD, then it's going to continue going, or they're going to have a lot of anxiety and tension about that. So, even if something has been double checked or triple checked, or if the behavior has been done over and over, if it doesn't feel right, it's almost like it doesn't count. And so the behavior continues, and that can really eat away a lot of time. So for example, let's say that you have OCD, and you have a compulsion in which you need to close your front door in a certain way. Right. So maybe you kind of lock the handle and you close it, and you want to make sure that the handle is locked because you don't want anybody to break in there. But when you close it, you have to hear this certain sort of thunk or like a certain clicking sound to make sure that the lock was engaged. And this becomes a compulsion, right? If you don't feel like that sound was right, or if it didn't feel right in your hand, if it just didn't give you the sense that, it was actually locked, then you're going to continue checking it and doing it over and over until it feels right. And often that feeling of rightness is fleeting. It may not ever be perfectly right. And even if it is, that only resolves that tension for a little bit. But that is a really strong element of OCD where it's just this tension and you want to resolve it. And it's just a feel sort of thing. But that's just, one example of compulsions. This can also include things like excessive hand washing for people that have contamination OCD. It can involve checking in on loved ones, like repetitive checking through text messages or phone calls. If you're a parent, it could mean peeking your head repetitively into your kid's room to just make sure they're still alive or something like that. Highly ritualized behaviors, like having to sit at a certain spot in the house at a certain time, eating the same food in the same place with the same utensils and bowl, etc. And then this is also where you get images of people who are engaged in like counting or repetitive tasks, stepping back and forth across thresholds, all of those sorts of repetitive things. So those are compulsions. And then on the other side, you have what are called obsessions or obsessive thoughts. And these are intrusive thoughts that come into your mind for no apparent reason. Typically, they're out of place and they might even be disturbing or scary. Now, there's one major difference that we need to clarify between the obsessive thoughts in OCD and something like delusions that you would see in psychosis. When someone is delusional, like if they have schizophrenia and they have delusions, they believe their thoughts fully. That is their reality. So when somebody has the delusion that, say, somebody's recording them from electronic devices in their house, they think they're being recorded through their television or through their, remote or their phone or their radio. They don't have insight that this is irrational. They believe that this is true. Now, on the other hand, with obsessive thoughts, these are usually unwelcome and they don't represent the way the person normally thinks. So it's out of place for them and it can be frustrating. And often the person will know this is an irrational thought, but they just can't get it out of their head, right? So it can be really maddening in that sort of way. Versus, delusions, they can be maddening in their own right because, of course, if you're afraid that somebody is watching you, it doesn't feel good. But it's not because that tension between reality and the thought you're having, those things are consistent with delusions. With intrusive thoughts, they are not consistent, right? And in some cases, obsessions aren't even fully formed thoughts. It's not like you have a narrative behind it. Sometimes for people, it's just like an image that flashes into their awareness. The obsession and the compulsion in OCD can sometimes be linked, but it's not always the case that they are. So, for example, in what was provided in the question, the person might have the compulsion of, double, triple checking their stove due to the obsessive thought that their house might blow up. So they have this thought like, oh, what if my house blows up because the gas is left on? And in that case, they go and check the stove over and over and over, and the obsession and compulsion are very linked together logically. The way it works is that the obsessive thought causes a rising sense of tension and anxiety in the person. And it doesn't feel like that anxiety is going to go away on its own. So the person engages in their compulsive behavior in an attempt to alleviate that tension. And it can help, right? If somebody goes and double checks something or they do whatever their compulsive behavior is, it can help reduce that anxiety, but only temporarily. One good way to think of how this plays out and how this can kind of come to be is to think of people who might be superstitious with sports. In some cases, there's a very fine line between sports superstition and OCD. And maybe you've even seen this in your life in a friend or a loved one, maybe a family member, where, somebody was watching the big game for whatever sport they follow, but they're watching their team. It was the final game and they were behind and they were sucking. And it's like, God, we're not going to win this one until the very end when the person just so happened to put on their hat, their team hat. And they're like, okay, come on, guys, you can do this. And wouldn't you know it, they pulled out an impossible victory. And so those two things got linked, that sort of illusory correlation got linked in this person's mind. And from that point on, they might wear that hat that caused their team to win every time they play. And then these things can chain, right? Maybe people have a hat. They have their certain place on the couch. Or maybe even more elaborate rituals like where they're supposed to eat on that day. Whatever it is, because it makes it feel like their team will win. I think I've mentioned this before somewhere, maybe on the podcast, but the movie Silver Linings Playbook that came out a while back now, it does a really great job of depicting this phenomenon. It's been a while since I've seen it, but the father character, played by Robert De Niro, he has this sort of OCD where it is sort of blending, or that fine line between just superstition from sports and full-blown OCD. I want to go back and watch it, and if you haven't seen it, I definitely suggest it. It depicts a lot of good mental health stuff, very accurate. But yeah, that's kind of one way you can think about how these things sort of develop in your brain. And one important note, even if, obsessions and compulsions are linked, they don't have to be logically connected, right? So in the case of, say, the intrusive thought of the house blowing up and repetitively checking the stove, it's a pretty obvious link. But, maybe imagine somebody who has the compulsion where they have to stare at a plane going through the sky. They have to stare at it intensely, maybe even without blinking, until it passes all the way through their vision. Otherwise, they think it might crash. Right? That's not exactly a very clear link, but them looking up at it helps them to sort of resolve that tension or that fear that the plane might crash. So it's not logically linked, but it can be, linked in terms of what one helping to prevent the other. So hopefully that's, a helpful primer on OCD and how it works. Obviously, it's more complicated than all of this. There's more detail. There are different subtypes. There are many, many different flavors of it. But let's get into the actual substance and the meat of what you're asking here. Really quick, though, before that, let's take a break and talk about our sponsor today. Okay, this episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. I mentioned before, but I've been trying to connect with people more this year, and I have definitely been doing a bit of that. I feel like I thought last month was going to, be the last month where things were really busy, but it doesn't seem to be the case. And it's been important for me right now to start to look inward and pay more attention to my own social battery. It's very easy for us to spread ourselves thin, especially when the social gatherings pick up and there's just so many things that we can go to and engage with. But what's the right amount of socializing for you? How do you recharge? Do you find that you're thriving around people, or are you getting burned out and need some more alone time? These are all questions that are very personal, and one tool that's amazing to gain this self-awareness and learn how to build a social life that doesn't drain you is therapy. If you're thinking about giving therapy a try, check out BetterHelp. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient and flexible and suited to your schedule. You just fill out a brief questionnaire, and that will get you matched with a licensed therapist. You can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. So find your social sweet spot with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/duff today and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/duff. Okay, so getting back into the actual question here, you mentioned that you've learned your attempts to help your friend in the past have been counterproductive. And this is really good insight. It's not like you're directly causing her harm, but essentially what you're doing is reinforcing her anxiety. Even though it's not technically considered an anxiety disorder anymore, it's been broken out into its own sort of diagnostic category. In my opinion, OCD is still at its core very much rooted in anxiety. So when your friend has the intrusive thought that somebody might be drowning in the lake, that anxiety drives them to want to go back and check to make sure that somebody is not drowning in the lake. The thing is, this type of anxiety isn't like the functional anxiety, the evolutionary anxiety that helps you get out of real danger. This is an unfounded sense of fear that will drive you to behave in these compulsive ways. In reality, there's nothing that needs to be done, right? Checking on whether somebody is drowning, checking the stove again, this doesn't change the fact of whether or not that thing actually happened. And that's not really what it's about. It's just this erroneous behavior that is trying to alleviate the anxiety. But truthfully, when you engage in checking behaviors or whatever the compulsion might be, it's actually avoidance. And a lot of people don't really recognize this nuance here. What I mean is that you're using the behavior, the compulsive behavior, to avoid the internal sensations of anxiety. Rather than tolerating them, rather than just sitting with it and not doing anything about it and letting things take their course, you're trying to find a way out of that to reassure yourself to avoid those internal sensations. Avoidance is a really big part of anxiety. I always say avoidance is the fuel of anxiety. And, for somebody with, say, panic disorder, they might feel a similar tension to what we're describing here when they're walking toward a crowded area. And as that tension rises, it might cause them to engage in avoidant behavior, where it gets so bad that they walk away, they bail out of the situation. And in this case, there's no direct problem to be solved. So the compulsive behaviors come in to sort of give that temporary relief, right? There's nothing to be done about the situation, but the person feels like they need to do something because it feels so bad inside. What actually needs to happen is for the person experiencing OCD to allow the anxiety to subside naturally without engaging in the behavior that they would normally do. And what we call this in, the clinical sense is exposure and response prevention, or ERP, which is one of the major, interventions for trying to work with somebody who has OCD. But, exposure means potentially exposure to both the situation that's related to the intrusive thought, as well as those internal sensations of tension and anxiety that I was talking about. They need to understand that feeling anxious or having a fear about something doesn't mean that it's actually going to happen. So it takes some work to kind of uncouple those things. On the exposure side, for instance, let's say that somebody has a harm-related intrusive thought of them stabbing a family member. I know that's a little intense, but often OCD is out of place and intense, and it can be very violent or very vivid. So definitely scary. So if somebody had this intrusive thought, this image of them stabbing, say, their child or their spouse, part of the exposure process might actually be for them to not hide all the knives in the house, right? To not feed into that by hiding them all. Or even to have them intentionally hold a fake or a real knife to generate those unpleasant sensations without avoiding them or without engaging in a compulsive behavior to reduce the anxiety. Because, it's not a delusion. It's not some sort of break from reality. This person does not want to harm their family member. They just have this image of them doing it. So them holding the knife isn't actually going to make it any more likely to happen. It's just generating that anxiety. And so, that's obviously a very, extreme example and something that you would want to work through with a therapist, but that's kind of the concept here. You don't need to avoid by actually avoiding a situation or avoid by doing checking behaviors and compulsions to relieve that internal sense of anxiety. So you, the question asker, you didn't commit any sort of heinous crime in the past. You haven't done something harmful to your friend. What you did is try to help in a logical way, of course, right? How would you know that that's not productive? So don't be hard on yourself about that. And it's also important to remember not every single second, every moment of every day is meant to be an exposure exercise. That could be exhausting. Like, let's say that you guys are trying to leave the house to go see a movie that you both really want to see, but she wants you to go check if the stove is, running or whatever. She said, "Hey, can you go check the stove again? I just feel like it's still on." Is it clinically helpful for you to go and tell her, "Yep, I checked, it's off"? No, of course not. It's not clinically helpful, but is it potentially the best option for that moment so that your friend's OCD doesn't interfere with the movie, which would in turn make her feel horrible about herself for, quote, ruining your night? Then possibly, yeah, right? Maybe it's better in that case to just, go ahead and do the thing, even if it's a little bit avoidant, because there's, more context to the situation. It's not just about that. You asked what you can do if helping her and reassuring her isn't the correct move. And I think there are a few things, but you need to remember OCD is tricky. It's sticky. You're not going to be the perfect support. And even if you were, that wouldn't cure her of the issue. So be kind to yourself. Don't put too much pressure on yourself here. But yeah, rather than fixing the issue for her by satisfying her compulsions, you can instead try to just comfort her, right? It's hard for her. The anxiety can be intense. So how about trying to help her with the anxiety itself rather than fixing a situation that isn't actually a problem? So for example, what you said is, she might ask, like, is there anybody drowning in the lake, or is there anybody in distress in the lake? So if she were to say that, she would say, "Hey, do you think there's anybody, in trouble in the lake? I feel like there's somebody there. Can you go check? Will you tell me?" You could give minor reassurance, like, "You know what? If somebody was in trouble, I'm sure we would know by now," right? But when she asks you to check and asks you to, can you just go look? You can say, "Why don't we just keep going and see what happens? Do you want to do something else? Should we listen to some music? Do something else together?" Right? And that would essentially be encouraging her to move on from what could potentially be a real sticking point, and instead try distracting, redirecting her so that she can experience the tension without actually responding to it directly. And then, of course, alternatively, if you know other ways that are good to soothe her anxiety, that's totally okay too. You guys can breathe together. You can give her a big hug. You can sit down and wait while she paces back and forth and, just has kind of an anxious moment. You can, do some sort of exercise together. Anything that would be helpful, that's all good. And you can reassure her that, she's going to be okay and that the feelings of anxiety are not going to hurt her. She's been through this before. She'll get through it again. Please be aware, though, sometimes intense anxiety from OCD, it can cause people to act in ways that aren't their typical selves. So, for example, when she's feeling really tense and you're not bailing her out by kind of joining in on the compulsive behavior, she might snap at you. She might get angry. It isn't personal, though. As you've seen, it's just hard. And sometimes you might feel like you're stuck between a rock and a hard place being her support person, and that's realistic. You just do the best that you can. The most important thing to her is that you care and that you're there for her, right? You aren't her therapist. You aren't her partner. You aren't her parent. You're her friend, and you're not abandoning her, even though sometimes it can be a little bit tough when this gets in the way. And that's absolutely what's going to matter in the long run. So thank you again for the question. Thank you for being a good friend and bringing up this important topic on the show. Okay, and we got one more question here. The response to this one will be, pretty short and sweet, but I think it's a great question. Here it goes. I like to think I'm a pretty laid-back person in life, but in the last year, I've graduated college and started a full-time job. With this, I've moved in with my boyfriend of 5 years, which has been great. However, I find myself being extremely set on my routines, waking up at 5 a.m. to work out every day, deep cleaning the entire house every weekend, meal prepping, and more. My routines, in air quotes, have become obsessive and made me controlling and not laid back in a way that I've never seen before. I can see that it's causing issues in my life, but I have a hard time stopping. Any advice? So again, good question. And also congratulations on taking a big step in your life. These things, these big things, even if they're according to the plan you had in your head, it still takes courage to take that leap and start that job or move in with a partner. So these are all very exciting things, and it's a really big time for you. Speaking of which, the biggest advice and ask that I have of you right now is to just go easy on yourself. You're going through a lot of change. You said that in the past year, you graduated college, started working full-time, moved in with your boyfriend. That is a lot to adjust to at once, right? That's a lot for anybody. And everyone deals with change in their own ways. I wonder if what we're seeing here is just your natural reaction to so much change happening all at once. In order to get through college, and I imagine you probably had other involvements, something in this reads as like overachiever to me. So you've probably been pretty busy. And in order to get through everything and be as successful as you have, you've developed your own routines, your own ways of doing things. This sort of structure allowed you to succeed, but now you're in a situation where it's not just you that you need to consider, and there's a lot more going on in the situation. So you're finding that your routines are becoming a bit more specific, maybe obsessive, which you're not satisfied with. I imagine what's going on is that even though you want to be living with your boyfriend, it maybe feels a little intrusive and maybe even a little bit threatening. It's just a big adjustment, and it's totally reasonable for it to cause you some stress. That's normal. Even if you know that you get along with the person, even if you've, kind of spent a lot of time cohabitating already, moving in can be just a bit different, even if it's only symbolically different. And so to have that stress, that doesn't mean that you don't want this to be the case. It doesn't mean that you made a mistake. It's just what it is. We all have our unique defense mechanisms. And for you, it sounds like when you feel unstable or out of control, you might focus in on the things that you do have control over. You lean into routine, schedule, and maybe even a little bit of ritual to make yourself feel more grounded. And that's okay to an extent, but here what we're seeing is that it's going a bit too far for your comfort. So what to do about this? I think the first thing is to try to recognize that, this is a pattern that's happening. Be real with both yourself and your partner about it. I gave you my interpretation, but perhaps there's more to it than I'm gathering. Only you know your history. Only you know your internal landscape, so to speak. Maybe you came from a really chaotic environment as a child. So exerting control is one of the things that helps you feel stable because you never got that when you were young. Who knows? I don't know what the answer here is, but take this as a prompt to do some self-reflection. Maybe that involves talking openly about it with others who know you, or enlisting the help of a therapist, for instance. Once you get some insight into this, whatever method you use, Once you get some insight into what's playing out, try to address it openly with your partner, explain the circumstances, and maybe even apologize if you feel like that's necessary. If you were to do that, it could go something like this. You could say, "Hey babe, I just wanted to say that I'm sorry. I haven't been acting the way that I want to lately, and I know I've been kind of snippy and angry, a little bit uptight about all of my specific routines, so I'm sorry if I made you feel bad. I want you to know you're doing a good job. This is a lot to adjust to for me, and I want you to know that my behavior isn't your fault. Can I explain a little bit about what I've come to realize?" Right. And so just opening it up like that. And from there, you could talk about how this is just a lot for you. And while you do want to be living together, you could give that reassurance that you want to be living together and pursuing this next phase of your life. Your natural reaction is to push back against what feels like chaos with control. And in some cases, maybe over control. So just simply opening that up, talking about it in a way that is, hopefully calm and loving and productive, that can go such a long way. Just having that out in the air can go a really long way toward reducing the amount of friction that it's causing in your relationship and in your life in general, right? We're not just talking about the relationship, your relationship with yourself, everything. You can also, take stock of your current routines and habits and evaluate how important each of them are to you. Is it important that you work out every day at 5 a.m.? It could be, right? If that's what makes you feel most mentally and emotionally strong, then great. If it doesn't interfere with your partner, even better. But if you take an honest look at it and you realize that it's just too much and it's actually making your quality of life worse because you're exhausted or maybe you're actually overworking yourself, then maybe you want to consider pulling back and adjusting. One simple exercise that you can do is pull out a notebook or a piece of paper or a note on your phone and list all of your current routines, right? All the main ones. And once you have them all down, for each one, you can write what you gain from them and then equally important, what you lose. So for example, let's take the deep cleaning the house every weekend. You can definitely gain stuff from that, right? It might give you peace of mind. It might give you a sense of stability going into the new week. Obviously, you gain a clean house, which you may value. But on the other side, you might lose opportunities to see friends. You might lose opportunities to connect with your partner. Another way to think of this is just a cost-benefit analysis for each one. And hopefully when you get to the end of that, there will be some routines that you want to keep just as they are. They're great. Some that you need to adjust in some sort of way. And then maybe even some that you are ready to move on from, that you want to give up. But actually giving it that time of day to write it down, to go through it and really think about these things is going to be helpful. And in the process, pay attention to any tension or resistance you feel to giving up these things, right? If you feel like you need to pull back from something, but it's really hard, you just feel bad about it, don't just ignore that. That tension might be telling you something important about yourself, which is another avenue to dive down with that self-reflection. So it's a time for growth. It's a time for looking at yourself. It's a challenge, but it's a worthwhile one. So go easy on yourself. And if you find that you do need some extra help, don't be afraid to reach out. This will get easier with time. So that's it for the show. Thank you both for the awesome questions. All of you listening, take care of yourselves out there. I will see you for the next episode. Bye. Thank you so much for joining me in this episode. If you would like to send a question or a topic for a future episode, please email me at duffthepsych@gmail.com. If you like my approach and would like to learn more about my books, online course, or other resources, please head over to my website at duffthepsych.com. And lastly, it would mean so much to me if you would leave a review for the podcast wherever you listen to it, or share an episode with a friend. Until next time, you got this.